Jarvis, drop my needle.
We're talking about foreshadowing. I mean, when you're good at foreshadowing, you can give the whole story away without anyone noticing. So let's take a look at some of the best examples from the MCU. So we all know that Iron Man has a thing for music. I mean, I started the video with a needle drop, but he's not the only one who likes a good musical motif. In the first Iron Man, Obadiah Stane is trying his absolute hardest to outdo Tony. From thinking he can run the business better, to even getting others to design a larger suit for him like he's overcompensating for something, he's constantly looking for ways to show that he's better than Tony. In the scene where we see him playing the piano, Stane is going through his supervillain speech, but the piece that he's playing is by a guy named Antonio Salieri, and while the rivalry between him and Mozart was greatly exaggerated, it's a good little bit of musical foreshadowing for when Stane calls the arc reactor Tony's Ninth Symphony. Now, why is that important? Is because similar to what the 27 Club is, there's believed to be a curse that if you make 9 symphonies, it's game over for you. And while there are a few examples, it was just started by a dude in the 19th century, so it's not very airtight. But just like Mozart, Tony was able to survive past that 9th symphony to go on and create other masterpieces, just like Ultron.
Here's where you're wrong.
When we first see the Red Skull in the first Cap adventure, you may notice that his head is not very red. Him not showing up as an alternative skin for Jack Skellington though is so that we can get that cool mask off reveal. But earlier in the movie, after Red Skull aggressively separates the soul from the Tesseract Guardian's body, we see a glob of blood on the Skull's Hydra pin, which foreshadows that aforementioned mask off reveal. We even get a similar look at Arnim Zola too, but he never got to get into that robot body of his with a face in the middle, so we can just leave him in the past. Trying to put a team together of super and not so super powered people was always gonna be hard. Nick Fury probably knew that going into it, but having the two anchors of the team, Steve and Tony, going at it probably wasn't on Fury's bingo card. They were able to pull it off, sure, but Steve telling Tony that he wasn't the one to make the sacrifice play hit deep. For most, if not all of his life up until that point, Tony had been selfish. He wasn't the one to do anything unless it benefited him, and from the first Avengers to the last, with the OG squad at least, it was his journey to prove Steve wrong. Hopefully it wasn't a spiteful one and more of an inspirational one, but we'll talk a little bit more about that journey later. Now, if you're not a very historically inclined person with respect to architecture, like myself, then when this shot in Winter Soldier came up on the screen, you probably paid it no mind. And then when the fight scene in the elevator happened, you probably didn't even remember it. But the thing that makes that building so important is that it's the Watergate Complex. Watergate being the place where one of the guys from Call of Duty Black Ops Zombies was found out to be, in fact, a crook. This ties to the B-plot of the movie where we find out the conspiracy that Hydra has actually been behind S.H.I.E.L.D. for all these years, and since this was shown right before we find that out, it's like a little nod saying, hey, there might be something going on here. Huh. Okay, well, this is awkward. We're back to talking about Tony Stark's journey quicker than I thought we would, but this time, it's more about the things he's created. So, in Age of Ultron, Ultron loves to quote and reinvent things that he read while on those message boards that made him want to destroy the world. One of the most live, laugh, love quotes that he remixes comes when he says that everyone creates the things that they dread. Obviously, Tony's been creating problems for himself and others for, well, decades at that point, but Ultron orchestrated his own downfall by trying to make a nice new body. If Ultron just did his whole destroy the world thing without trying to upgrade his body faster than people trying to upgrade their phones, maybe the Age of Ultron would have lasted a little bit longer. With Civil War seeming like the Avengers 2.5 with the amount of new and returning characters, it's easy to forget that it's a story about two friends. Well, two friends that drive a wedge between another two friends. I mean, yeah, sure, Bucky and Steve are close, but so are Tony and Steve. So much so that during Spidey and Cap's fight, Spidey mentions that Tony told him to go for the head. No, wait, sorry, read that wrong. It's go for the legs. Sometimes I get my body parts mixed up. Anyway, we see that same advice later when Tony finds out what happened to his parents, because he pretty much immediately ties Steve's legs up to stop him. The cynic in me says that he only knows this for Tower of Babel scenarios, but I also just like to think that he likes to know the ins and outs of his friends' fighting styles. I mean, that's in character, right? Now, let's talk about the mighty Odin's son. The 5-year span between Thor Ragnarok and Endgame had to be the worst in his 15-year life. I mean, his dad joins the Odin Force, he has to fight his sister, his brother's neck gets gripped a little too hard by Thanos, he loses his home, and he loses an eye. But at least that's only for a little bit. And so of course, we're gonna talk about the least impactful one, since that was actually foreshadowed right before it happened. So when Hela tore down the Asgardian mural during her takeover, if you look at Thor, you'll see that there's a giant slash across his right eye, and wouldn't you know it, Hela blinds Thor in that exact same eye. I mean, yeah, that sucks, but just remember everything else that I said happened to him. Doesn't really seem that bad in comparison anymore now, does it? For this next one, you're in for a twofer. So in the beginning of Infinity War, Thanos talks about how he knows what it's like to lose and that it turns your legs to jelly, which is not as delicious as it sounds. Fast forward to Endgame, and just when he realizes that he lost, the first thing he does is take a seat. It's also a pretty cool inverse of the Infinity War ending where he sits and smiles since he actually won. The second piece of foreshadowing comes from T'Challa when he tells Proxima Midnight and Cull Obsidian that in Wakanda, Thanos will have nothing but blood and dust.
You should choose your words more carefully.
Now, it's pretty eerie that he was that dead on, although pretty sure he didn't think it would end exactly the way it did. Okay, now we're at the end of Tony's journey. It's been over 10 years, so how do you think they're gonna foreshadow that it's coming to an end? Could it be a reference to a line early in the movie, or maybe there's a picture somewhere with Tony's face on it that's super dusty? It's actually neither of those, and actually has to do with the ship that he's on floating aimlessly through space. While it's floating, it resembles the shape of a swallow, which for sailors symbolize the end of their journey, because if there's birds around, they must be close to land. I thought that they could have used a swan to symbolize this being his swan song, but that would have looked a little too similar to a goose, and no one needs to be reminded of them and their freaky teeth. Finally, let's end on another 2-for-1 special. During Spider-Man Far From Home, Pete still has a lot of growing up to do. He's searching for a mentor figure since, well, the other one is in that big science lab in the sky, and initially, he thinks that he's found one in Mysterio. I mean, yeah, Pete is pretty gullible, some might even call him a fool, so it makes sense that when we and Pete first see Mysterio in action, Peter's wearing a different type of mask. This particular mask is that of a fool, which as the name sounds, is usually worn by easily manipulated and overly trusting people during old-timey plays. You'd think he'd have learned his lesson, but No Way Home makes it seem like the whole with great power comes great responsibility thing wasn't something he learned, and the second example of foreshadowing comes at the end when Spidey and Mysterio have their standoff. If you look closely to Mysterio's hand, he's holding the glasses like a gun, which after we see Pete's Spidey sense, I will never call it the other thing, makes sense since he was holding a gun to his head. Maybe it has to do with his clone needing to have the same grip. Who knows? But I love little details like Chekov's glasses. Really keeps the movies engaging. The MCU is constantly juggling between having standalone movies that can be enjoyed without context while also telling grandiose and long stories. Doing all that while also trying to give the eagle-eyed viewers something to look out for with story significance is honestly crazy to think about. I just make these videos and it's hard for me to keep track of the entries sometimes. I can't imagine 20 plus movies or 30 plus in the future, whichever is closer to when you watch this. Trying really hard to just future-proof all my videos.